Nature Breakthroughs with Dr. Wild Ben Goldman. Conversations with changemakers in a world gone mad. To discover what you need for personal, organizational, and societal change, get your free download of 3 ancient rituals smart entrepreneurs use to bounce back from shifts in the market and inside themselves. Go to www.naturebreakthroughs.com.
Yes, you pull them till they bite down. On the lies that you built from my doubt. I don't want money, I don't want cars, I just want to be free.
Welcome, AJ Strahorn and Rachel Strahorn, to the Nature Breakthrough Podcast. Conversations with changemakers in a world gone mad. How you guys doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having us.
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be on your podcast.
Well, you all are amazing individuals. You're the podcasters of the whole conversation, or THC, and I met you through a family member. I hope I can say that, who's involved with my program called TLC, which is Transgender Living with Change, and which is a program for family of people who are transgender. And I'm delighted to have you guys here. And I can't tell you how brilliant I think your THC podcast is. And I'm just really curious to learn more about you guys. Like, how did you become so smart? That's my first question.
I don't know. Our dad might take credit for that. He might say that was genetics and he passed it down. But I mean, it probably is a little bit of both our parents being like on us about school. And I think because we were kind of, I don't want to say like push, but we had support when it came to school. And, you know, we just really worked hard. So I guess we could just say that paid off.
Well, you know, I just listened to your latest podcast on capitalism, and a couple things strike me. One is, well, first of all, how sharp you guys are. And second of all, you know, like just some of my background is I was a history student as an undergraduate, and I actually studied Eastern European history and studied for a year in London, where I learned a lot about Marxism and through all of that work. And then I went on to get a PhD in public policy. So I became like an expert in political economy and the way government and the economy and the private sector and public sector work together. And, you know, when I listen to you talk, I'm like, did they do everything that I did? I mean, did you guys, you know, well, what we used to call like become, you know, now it has a negative connotation, but back then, the idea of being kind of radical or radicalized when I was your age meant being progressive. And, you know, from my perspective, meant like getting like a handle on how the world works and what's really going on. And so that's one thing that amazes me. Like, how did you guys end up seeing the world the same way that I do? Or at least that's sure as heck what it sounds like. And the other thing I want to say is, and then I'm going to let you talk. And I learned from the top podcaster, like what's his name, Joe Rogan. He says he never asks his guests questions. That if you got to ask a question, it means the conversation's not going well. But you know, one thing that strikes me, that I find interesting, is you're like, you know, basically the next generation. I'm like your dad's age, your parents' age, or older. I don't know, or probably roughly. And you're like my kids' age. And there's this idea that people have, you know, that everything changes with a new generation. And when I listen to you, I just see me. Like, and the differences that I see, I mean, there are a lot of differences, of course, but one main one is, you know, I was raring to change the world back then, and went into, I didn't know to do, and I was kind of lost. And of course, back then there was no podcast, there was no internet, there was broadcasting, major networks. And what I did was I went to I hung out in activist circles and moved to New York and started working at a progressive think tank and started doing research that and working directly for a whole bunch of different activist organizations, and kind of devoted my early life to that. And I eventually kind of burned out, so I'm in a different place now. But I guess one of the things I'm curious about is, how do you see, since I feel like we don't have a lot of disagreement in our perspective, but we're kind of like, you're heading into your adulthood, like a generation later than me. How do you see, what's your strategy? And I don't know that much about what you guys do for a living or outside of the podcast. How do you want to make change in the world that you think is necessary?
Well, in terms of background, so I'm actually a pediatric nurse, and right now I'm doing travel nursing. And so my background.
What kind of nursing?
Travel nursing. So I take contracts at different hospitals for a certain period of time, mostly 12, 13 weeks.
Locum tenens for the nurses?
They what?
They call that the Latin locum tenens, I think it's called. That's what the doctors call it.
Oh, really? No.
It means you're temporarily deployed to different places and you get paid more money, and it's doctors do that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of healthcare professionals do it. So currently that's what I'm doing, and just traveling and everything. So my background is in healthcare, and I've considered this question, and I feel like AJ and I have talked about kind of how to implement these things and get people to hear the way we're feeling. And I think that's a big reason why we started the podcast. I think that was our attempt because we know how powerful and how prominent podcasts are. And so I think that was our first attempt to at least just get out there and hopefully start conversations. Because at least in my opinion, conversations, especially in your home, especially in school, are the things that are going to influence you. And I think that's going to spark the change. For me, the biggest change is influencing the next generation behind us and growing them up with mentalities, that are not to say mentalities that are how we see the world, but just mentalities that have everybody's best interests at heart, and peace and good, and equity and things like that.
Well, I first want to just thank you. It sounds like you are one of the frontline heroes of the last year, and I'm sure that was quite an experience for you. And I'd be curious to hear more about that. But thank you for your work.
My background is kind of also in the healthcare field. I'm a pharmacy technician right now. I live in Cincinnati, work right across the river over in Kentucky at a mail order pharmacy. I've been doing pharmacy work for a little while now, maybe about 4 or 5 years. And then in terms of the podcast and everything, Rachel was spot on. That really was, we were like, what can we do? Because we felt like we were talking to each other or talking to our mom or our dad and having these conversations within ourselves. And we were like, why doesn't anybody else think like this? Why doesn't anybody else have these conversations? And so we were like, how can we, put that out there to other people? And so we came up with the podcast idea. And I think ideally we'd love to just grow this as big as possible and see what ways we can branch out and help other people. That's kind of my mindset. I want to grow and make money and all of this stuff and get influential just so I can help other people.
And did you create the theme song for your podcast?
Yes, I did.
Can I say that's dope, or is that I'm too old?
No, I appreciate that. So I make music as well. I've got a EP out right now. It's called Three Kings: An Introduction to Me, Myself, and I. It's out on Apple, Spotify. Um, it's typical rap music, so it's not gonna be everybody's cup of tea. It's for adults. It's your normal hip hop, but it's something I love making music and just being involved with music. So doing this type of stuff helps me be able to be creative. And I think we both have this like creative streak that we felt like we needed to explore.
Well, it's fantastic. So I mean, I guess one of the things that strikes me is I know that when I was your age, with the kind of views of the world that I had, I felt like I was, there weren't many of us. It was a real minority perspective in the country. And in fact, I don't think I would have fully developed it unless I had left the country and lived abroad for a while. And I would have never learned that perspective, like going to college here or anything like that. I had to learn it through my own experience and through elsewhere. I mean, do you feel like it seems to me like the stuff that I spent decades fighting for is now becoming more mainstream and being talked. But do you feel like this kind of progressive perspective is still you're like on the margins?
I mean, I think it's twofold. I think in a way, yes, it still is kind of this minority idea. And I think people are afraid but I think the other part is that people are afraid to speak up and they're afraid to be judged because it kind of has this bad connotation still. Just like when you're talking about the idea of radical, I think it's becoming more mainstream and people are becoming more accepting with the new generations. But I still do think there is a larger number than people think of people who still kind of have the not so liberal view or social view of things and see it the way we do.
I mean, you find it that a lot of people your age feel the same way you do, or is it hard to tell because we're all in our little bubble?
Right. I think I try and keep the people around me who do feel the way I do. So the people in my circle typically do in terms of like very close friends and luckily my family, those people they do. But outside of that, sometimes it's like one of those things where especially in terms of my case, like working in the healthcare field and where I was initially in a predominantly like white atmosphere, you don't always feel comfortable having those conversations with people in the workplace just because you don't want to be seen like confrontational or anything like that. That's still a stereotype. So for me, it I don't always try and figure out, like I have my circle and I know, and AJ and I are working to expand from that. But in certain areas and environments, unfortunately, we're promoting having the conversation, but unfortunately there are times where I still don't feel comfortable having those conversations and really figuring those things out because of the connotation of those conversations and of who it would be coming from.
Yeah, it's almost like people are kind of cool, like getting wet up to their ankles, but as you start to really try to get in there, I think there's still that wave that you still kind of have that pushback. So I think we're getting there. I think we're growing for sure, but I still think there are barriers to overcome, especially the deeper you get. I think some of the more obvious things people are picking up in their mindset is more the same, but I think again the deeper you get into it, maybe not as much.
Well, I like that you talk about, one, it sounds like part of your mission is to broach taboos. And, just like that last episode about capitalism, where you're more open to the possibilities that that's not the only way to organize a society. Whereas, a lot of what happened, the political talk in America demonizes alternatives. And but I also, I've been just a little bit of my background. I was been active in, racial justice issues. One of my kind of claims to, it's not fame because I'm not, well, that's a whole nother story. But one of the things that I did early in my life was I wrote the first national study to prove that what's called environmental racism exists in America. And it went on to create a national social movement. And, it's now it's being talked about all over the place. Now the whole concept of environmental justice. But I have to tell you that as someone who's perceived, here, let's get right into the taboo. Someone who's perceived as white, for example, I found that my options working in that movement were very limited. And in fact, I kind of left it in part because of, I mean, this is like a tricky subject, but I'd love to talk to you guys about it. And I just part of it is I'm like, well, back then, I'm Jewish, and I was like a Jewish radical and have been my whole life. Oh, one thing I want to say about the word radical is when I think of the word radical, to me, it means getting to the root. That's the Latin root of the word radical. It means root. And now it's been used in the popular media to mean like a terrorist or a violence, And I always, so a lot of words change over time in their connotation, but I also find it in this whole kind of racialized, highly kind of charged racialized world that we live in. It's I don't know. I'd like to talk more about it because I don't think we talk about it enough among anyone, and nobody talks about it enough. I mean, well, maybe people of color talk about it amongst themselves, but different people from different backgrounds tend to avoid it, like you say, because it's. I think people want to avoid the possibility of conflict. But
Well,
I love conflict in a way. If we can get deep, as long as we can get to the root of it.
I mean, we always say in our podcast when we're closing out, we always tell people we love if you disagree. We love whatever you have to say, because even if you're radical or whatever, the conversation is the most important part. So, we love if people's ideas don't even look like ours, or we love if they are on the side of ours. It's just a conversation in general. But I think in terms of what you were talking about race, I mean, I feel like it is talked about, but I also think like there's also this notion, and honestly, I feel like it comes from maybe, the generation above us, this idea that people are so hypersensitive. I have to censor what I say nowadays. And I feel like, to me, it's not really censorship, it's just considering other people. But I think sometimes that's why people don't have the conversation about race, because they're like, oh, they're hypersensitive to it, or I don't want to be bothered with censoring, so I'm not even going to say anything at all. I don't want to offend them, and then that's going to make me mad, or whatever the case may be. So I think that's a big thing. But I wish we would stop categorizing consideration as censorship, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Well, I don't know that I fully understand what you mean by categorizing consideration. Can you just open that up a little? What do you mean by categorizing?
Yeah. So typically,
that's a cool phrase. That's one of the things you do great, is you come up with great phrases.
So I feel like in terms of that, I would say, when I mean consideration, I mean, and the examples I'm referring to are if someone has to be specific to someone's pronouns, right? So if someone's, I go by they, them, and and they maybe make a joke about it or something, and that person is offended because that's how they identify. And then, person A is now like, oh, I have to I have to censor myself, or you're so sensitive, you know, in that circumstance. And I feel like we've all maybe seen or heard of a circumstance like that. And so that's what I mean. So for the person who identifies as they and them, and this is who they are, right? They just feel like, you know, you respect me enough. You are just considering, you know, this is how I identify. This is, you know, what I'm requesting of you. It's not that much, you know, just consider how this makes me feel. And so that other person is just feeling like, oh, we can't say anything, everybody's sensitive, instead of realizing that no, that person just wants to be respected, as who they are.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, I don't think it's a request for people to censor themselves. I agree. I think it's a request for people just to be considerate, like to think before you speak. And honestly, that goes both ways, because I think some of it is, if people of color are in conversations and they're trying to correct someone, I know sometimes we can be fed up. And so the way we correct someone can be harsh. And then if that's what they take away from the situation, it may make it difficult for them to even want to try again. So I mean, you have to try. Like, you have to try and be willing to accept that you might get corrected, you might say something wrong, like you might offend somebody, but you will never learn if you don't attempt. Like, it's what I tell people in my family. Like, if you love me and you mess up my pronoun but you correct yourself, I'm not going to make a big deal out of that, because I know, you know, you're trying, you're learning, you're putting the effort forth. You know, you knew me as 20 something years one way. I understand that. It's when people aren't considerate, when they don't take the time to think, when they thought about it and just decided not to do it. Like, I think those are where you start to have issues.
But people don't have to try. I mean, that's the thing. And as things change, you know, I don't know if it's only true about older people, but maybe it's more true about older people. They don't want to try, and right, they get kind of stuck in their way,
Hmm.
in their ways, and I think that's part of what the tension is that there are a lot of people that are like, I don't have to try. That's not about me, and you guys can just stay over there, and I'll stay over here, and I'm not going to try.
But they will try once it is about them. That's the thing.
Of course, then it's not a try. That's not trying to see someone else's perspective. That's just uh, voicing their own.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, I think that's where.
I mean, I think we'd like to see people kind of become lifelong learners, basically. And I think that's where we're trying to be, to the point that I'm never too old to learn something new. I'm never too old to gather new information and change. So if I said something that up until I'm 90 years old, and at 90 I get a new piece of information that makes me look at something different, I'm gonna look at something different at 90. Or at least that's the goal. I think that's what we are hoping to kind of spread and pass on to people, that idea that things change. That's the only constant is change. So being stuck in your ways isn't always going to be the most beneficial thing, not only just for you but for everybody else.
Yeah, I just think that the way people are learning, you know, it's mostly through social media, and people might think they're learning, but people are might be engaged in a form of learning, but it's not necessarily rooted in in a kind of authentic connection with other people. It's more rooted in a spit, you know, this crazy spin, media spin, and like what distortion. And I mean, that's how so many people seem to be learning now. You know, I walked the dog with my girlfriend this morning, and she's talking to me about a video she's watching about, I guess it was an African American woman it's like a Victoria's Secrets.
Mhm.
Oh, I haven't seen it. And so a white woman, I think, who, and I didn't see it, but it sounds like that the African American woman started taping the white woman after the white woman had done something that had insulted the African American woman, and then the white woman started had like a breakdown and started crying and saying, stop videotaping me. And, and I could hear my girlfriend, who's actually a psychiatrist, trying to like figure out like who's right and who's wrong in this situation, and I mean, that's a hard way to learn anything, through that kind of snippets of media. And just, I mean, well, how do you guys deal with that?
I actually know about the video you're referring to, and the video itself is interesting. But I think I have a love-hate relationship with social media. I think in a way it really has done a good job of connecting us and allowing us to see different perspectives and allowing for people to see things that maybe they never would have. Even if you can't physically get outside your neighborhood, sometimes social media exposes you to those different things. And so in that sense, I think it's good. Sometimes I don't know about something until I see it on social media, and it keeps me up on current events. But also, I think, like you said, there is distortion on social media. You don't get the full picture, and everybody has something to say. And so sometimes it's hard to decipher what's true and what's not. And to be honest, I don't know if that's ever going to improve. And I feel like I always ask people this question, like, do you think that the news is going to go away? Because no one I know watches the news other than, like my parents and my grandparents or things like that. But I truly think social media is just going to be our new everything from now on. And it kind of scares me because, like I said, I have a love-hate relationship. And right now I'm kind of in my hate phase, which I feel like is not helpful to us promoting our podcast and, the social changes we want to make. But
social media is something else, man. It's interesting. Like, I definitely agree. The love-hate relationship, totally. Because I think it's one of those things, like, its intentions are kind of, just right down the middle, and then people can either use it for good or use it for bad. So it just depends on, people's mentality and how they decide to use it. And I think that, at least for us, I think having an open mind is actually helpful in social media, because you can look at a post and recognize I don't have all the information, so I can't make a full judgment. And I'll find myself, even being like, well, if this is what happened, then I think this. But if this is what happened, then I think this. And I think that's perfectly okay. But a lot of people don't. They're like, no, I have to make a decision if this is right or wrong. And then once I say it, I have to back it up. And if I don't have anything to back it up with, then I'm just going to like throw insults or change the subject. And I think that's where things get to the point where they're not productive anymore. And it's hard to find the truth. A lot of things people say in social media, I mean, you can fact check or at least attempt to fact check. And again, that's where keeping an open mind is helpful. Like, you're like a sponge. Just grab as much information as you can. The more information that you get, that's actually a better thing. I think being able to say, I don't have a 100%, I'm torn about it, or I'm on the fence. I have these kind of opposing views about it. I'm working through that. I think that's a good thing. And I think that's fine. But people, I think, have been very like, I have to have an opinion on it. And then once I stamp that as my opinion, then I got to stick with it. And with social media, once you put something out there, it's out there. So people are, I can't have this pose at this point. Somebody saw this on my page and now I'm saying this. And I don't think that always helps. But ideally it would, because it would open us up to global perspectives.
Well, when I listen to you guys, first of all, what's your conversation with each other. I wish I could have conversations like that with my siblings. I mean, we can joke around, but you guys go deep, and you guys are so respectful of each other. But I just, what I want, I wish everyone in America could listen to your podcast, but I wonder who does listen, and who, who is having that kind of conversation, like the kind that you're having, which feels very open minded and, opinionated, but you also, you guys really sound like that curiosity is a big driver, as opposed to just opinionating, which is what which is, you know, what gets most of the attention.
I think for me, because sometimes when we talk about things, I know I can get, and we both can get very passionate, and so sometimes I feel like maybe it sounds like we're just projecting what we feel and we want people to see it how we see it, but really, like you said, it's just curiosity. We're just, like, this is how we see it. We're curious. Are there other perspectives? Please let us know. Should we, evolve how we see things? And so it is just our curiosity, but I think the foundation is respect. And I think that's why our conversations with each other are so respectful, because we feel like, respect is a human right, and we think if things were based off of just respect and good for all people and equity, it would benefit everyone. And I think that's when you were talking about people don't want to try. We feel like that's why we're pushing that, because we feel like, if you do just take the time and try, realize how it will ultimately benefit you as well. And so I think that that's the basis of our conversations.
I think it's interesting also that we talked about the word radical and the fact that it means root, because I feel like that's also something really that we try to do. I mean, we talk about, we're digging deep, and that's the thing, getting to the root of things. I think that's something that we really like attempt to do when we're looking into things. I know at least when I'm, researching something, if I'm thinking about something, I'm gonna ask myself why as far back as I can. Like, what's the root of this? Like, what is the crux of this? What's the main thing? Because a lot of times the details and the outer stuff, that's very subjective. It changes from person to person, and that's where respect comes in. Being able to respect and recognize somebody else's truth, being able to agree to disagree and walk away. But I think when you're able to like really get to the root of it, that's when you can really start to think about solutions. And so we get to the root, start thinking about solutions, and that's why we're like, tell us what you think, because we're not gonna pretend like we got all the answers. This is what we're seeing. So fill in the gaps for us.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, I think, to be honest, though, we were really privileged in the way that we were given opportunities to question things and pushed to, like, not just submit to authority. And so in that sense, I feel like because that was our foundation, that's why we're able to do this. And like, it's been a mindset, and that's why, in my opinion, it's so important to really educate that young generation and allow them to grow up with this mindset as well.
Let me pick a bone with you just to keep things as controversial as I can, which is, one of the things I heard you guys say. Well, first of all, you are. I don't want to say this in a patronizing way, but there's an idealism in the way you talk, which is great. Not the way you talk. I'm saying in the capitalism episode, you okay, that didn't come across great. Let me rephrase that.
I understand what you mean.
You guys have like big dreams.
Right. Oh yeah, it's idealistic for sure. Like in a perfect world, everyone would just get
utopia.
along.
And you guys contextualize it, say utopian and stuff, but you're pushing for big change and big things. And one of the things that you said in there, though, that I kind of not that I'm trying to look for something I might not agree with, is the idea of not having like career politicians. And you've said, I heard it a couple times in the last episode about wanting people to kind of go in, do what they can, and in a term and leave. And I guess I understand the motivation behind that, but I have a problem with that idea. I mean, I have a problem with that because having worked in politics for a while, it takes time to figure out how it takes time to develop. It takes time to figure out how to get things done. It takes time to develop power. It takes time to persuade. Things take time. And when a person is a public servant, they're not just dealing with other public servants. They're dealing with the private sector. They're dealing with the nonprofit sector. They're dealing with individuals who don't have term limits, you know, and the problem I see, you know, a big problem that we have in this country is that there's power amassed in the private sector that can push the government around at times. And you know what we need is to kind of balance the power. We need a mixed economy where there's a balance between government and the private sector. And I'm pretty convinced that if there were term limits, if that became a real thing, you're just basically decapitating the power of government, because you're going to have a lot of people that don't know what they're doing coming and going. And you know, if you've ever worked in an organization, the higher the turnover, the less effective things are. And so, but you know, so the question to me, the kind of trickier question is, how do you develop public sector competence without corruption? You know, that, and I don't think term limits will do it. That's there. I'm going to put an argument to you.
I mean, I think there are always alternatives, and so, you know, okay, maybe it's not just one term, but it's not a lifetime. You know, it can be for an extended period of time, but that's not your career. Also, make minimum wage. You know, I saw someone actually posted on TikTok. They were like, why don't government officials make minimum wage? You know, you're public servants. And I agree with that. And I think that's also an alternative, you know, to ensure that they're actually doing this for the good. They gain nothing else from this, right? Because that's supposed to be what it's about, is it not?
But you can hear a lot of, I mean, I don't know about you, but my mind fills up with a whole bunch of answers to that question. Like, doesn't yours? Like, the reason why you don't want your public servants to be making minimum wage is because that's a guarantee of corruption. That means those people are going to be desperate for money, and you're guaranteed that the system.
And I think that's I think that's the point of it, though, right there, to be like, oh, you're desperate for money on minimum wage, you don't have any money. Maybe you ought to think about, is the minimum wage actually where it should be? How has the minimum wage risen with the cost of living, the cost of housing, food, college, everything? If you're realizing that, oh, I can't live off of this, well, how you think your constituents can live off of this? So I think that was the idea behind it, was to say, if this actually affects you, right? Like, people don't have to try, right? But once it actually affects you, now it's your life. Now it's like, oh, I see why this hurts. I see why this is difficult. I see why y'all are fighting for a $15 minimum wage or whatever. So I think that was the logic behind it, and the idea of taking the private sector more out of it, especially in campaigning, it would be like another layer to help remove some of that corruption. We don't think like that would get all of it. There's going to be corrupt people, obviously, regardless. And I definitely agree. I don't think it would necessarily be one term, but I think putting a limit on it would be beneficial, to say, like, you have this much amount of time, come in here and really try to work. And if everyone who's coming in is of that mindset, right? If we're educating people about really how the country really works, the true history of the country, right? If we're educating people on the true history of the country, if we're educating them truly on how the system works, truly what it means to be in government, and then we're giving them the opportunity to come in there, do their best at it, you know, try it, give it their all for the true reasons, because they really want to see people succeed. Again, it's idealistic, of course. We recognize that, but you shoot for the ideal, right? You shoot for the moon, so you land among the stars. So if you shoot for that ideal, we would be hoping that people's mindset would either, they would be directly affected enough that it would force their mindset to be that way, or they would come in with the mindset of truly realizing how connected they are to everyone, to all of America, to all of humanity, not just the corporation that paid this much money, not just these certain people who they see every day, but really everybody.
Yeah, it's like they're so far removed from what they're trying to govern. And so, it's like even in terms of healthcare, sometimes it gets frustrating because we're the people who are deciding things for the nurses or what's going on are so far removed. They're not there at the bedside and things like that. And so it gets frustrating when those people don't really know firsthand what you're going through, and then they're making decisions for you, but they're living a completely separate life. And so I think that was like our biggest thing of, something has to be done. And I think, yeah, like he said, like if they're not living off of minimum wage, then it might be a wake up call and something actually might be done. It's like, if you don't want to trade places with that other group, why is that?
Right.
Like Jane Elliott did. If, no, none of the white people wanted to trade places with the black people, why is that? Then you obviously know there's a discrepancy and something needs to be changed.
It feels like I'm thinking of it like more like a chess. Like this is almost like you're talking like a chess move that you're not. Your goal isn't that the public servant should get minimum wage as much as your goal is that the minimum wage should be a livable wage that they would want to that would inspire people to want to be a public servant. And
Exactly.
so, but the tricky the problem with that I see with a way without so it's kind of like it's a devious strategy or something. The problem with being devious in with it, I think, is that what you'll get in government will be people that have independent income streams who would do it. I mean, if this let's do like a thought experiment and this happened tomorrow that they got paid they got minimum wage, you would basically lose everyone that doesn't have an independent income, and you would just, I think the conflict of interests among public servants would just be, you hear what I'm saying? So this is tricky stuff. Like you can't just like you move one piece of the puzzle, and all kinds of unintentional consequences can happen.
I mean, this would never be something that would happen tomorrow. Like it would be like that's why we say like fill in the gaps for us, because a lot of times we're not going through the whole like gradual step process. It's more like this is where we are, this is where we want to get to. There's a couple ideas of how we might be able to get there. We haven't worked out the specifics on it, but like we got any other general ideas that we can look into and figure out the specifics, because you're definitely right. I mean, if you just drop this on the people in there tomorrow, it would be absolute chaos. Like we even said, if we turn this into a utopian world and we were like, we're getting rid of the ownership and everything's everybody's, and we just did that tomorrow, it would be chaos. And so I think what we're doing is actually difficult because we're attempting to affect people's mindsets. It's a mindset. It's the way you think that we're trying to get to. Because then if all the people who are going into that think that way, that's a very different situation than all of the people in there thinking how they currently think, right? So if everyone's going in there already with the mindset of I'm here to do the most good for the most people, I feel the connection to my fellow humans, I feel that connection to humanity, I recognize the limit, my limits, and I want to be cooperative. Them getting minimum wage might actually be the challenge. Like, okay, they might take it that way, versus the people who are in there now would definitely, not take it that way. And that's not to say like there's great politicians, like don't get us wrong. There's plenty of people in there fighting for great stuff. Like, we're not trying to say all politicians are bad. I mean, we got politicians in our families. So, not at all. But I definitely think that a lot of this stuff will be something that would have to be gradual. And that's why working and trying to adjust mindsets is a gradual thing. It's why, I think it's why Jim Crow was as effective as it was, because yeah, you may change the laws, but until you change people's hearts and people's minds, they find ways to still do what they want to do. So when you're getting to a culture, when you're getting to a mind, you got to be persistent, you got to be willing to take time with it. And that's why we're hoping we can get a big enough audience that it's like, enough people working on it together to at least get that ball rolling and get that moving, because it's gonna be a process.
When I do a lot of work involving change, and there's I part of it, I think, is there's kind of like a trinity of change. There's a before, there's an after, and then there's the during, the process. And that's the complicated part.
Mhm.
I don't know if we can switch gears a little, since how we met, and you brought up the issue of pronouns and stuff like that. You want to talk a little bit about those kinds of transitions, or you want to stick to politics?
No, that's definitely fine. So I'm transgender. I'm a transgender male. So that means that the sex that was given to me at birth was female. I started my transition in 2017. So this will be going on 3 years now. I think for me, it was probably one of the scariest but best things at the exact same time. So it was like a really crazy feeling and experience, but no regrets absolutely at all. I know that was something that our dad particularly was concerned about, but if anything, I was like, I wish I could have done this, as a kid. I wish I could have started this way. But I mean, Rachel can talk about how it was, from her experience being on the outside. But I did try to include my family as early as possible, because I didn't want them to feel like they were just totally on the outside, looking in.
So say again, it happened. What ages? When did you come out?
I started my transition in 2017, December of 2017. So originally, I came out initially as gay to my parents in high school. I was like maybe junior year of high school. So that would have been 2009, 2010 ish, and then I started my transition in 2017.
And I don't know how old you are. You don't have to tell me, but what were you in college when this was happening?
I had actually graduated college. I did a year and a half in med school when all of this kind of came to a head. So I'll be 29 this year. So I was 26.
Okay.
An adult, past the quarter century mark.
So you did it as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And what have you? Well, I'm not sure. I'm finding myself thinking of a question, which is probably a bad sign. I guess what I want to ask you is, there's so much. Well, since I run this group, which is family of transgender and gender expansive people, I guess I hear different things. I hear from the parents often fear. They're afraid, and from partners, it's less about fear and more about things like grief and anger. And there's grief with the parents sometimes, because there's a sense of a loss.
Mm-hmm.
If you've known someone in one way, and they then tell you need to start knowing them in another way, there can be a sense of loss. But I guess my question is, with the fear, being a black man in America, we all hear about the talk, which obviously you couldn't have gotten, since you were not identified as a black man when you were a child. And I don't know if your parents have fear. There's obviously horrible statistics about how transgender people are treated, and it's particularly. I'm just wondering, how's it been? I mean, is the fear justified, or or should people just kind of relax and not be so afraid?
I mean, I definitely understand the fear. I feel like I have personally been very, very lucky in that I've had a ton of support. the people that, you know, my family, my closest friends, and everyone's actually been really supportive. But I know there are people out there who are not supportive. So, you know, I told Rachel, I think we might have brought this up last season, actually. One of the things that was kind of holding me back almost, or made me really stop and think before transitioning, was actually that fact. Like, do I want to be a Black man in America? Like, that is huge. It's a big weight, and it's a lot going on. So, I mean, we didn't necessarily like get the talk, but I think there was always just still kind of like this understanding. So I think I've always like kind of grown up that way, but I do feel like I pay a little bit more attention now, like a little bit more cautious about things. I think it's just having to be like mindful about things. And I think the fear that people, you know, feel is that obviously someone or someone's are gonna hurt you or be violent toward you or take their personal fear and feelings out on you. And the unfortunate thing is that can happen at any point for any reason. Like, we can always be scared of that. So I think that even though to an extent it's justified,
When you say we, you mean in particular
people
anybody,
like, yeah, anybody. I mean,
cis, trans, anybody, you know, black, white, or are you being more specific?
anybody, anybody. And so that's why, you know, I think to a degree it's justified, but I think the bigger thing is finding a way to get past the fear so that you can be supportive, because I think the support helps to mitigate those experiences. So those experiences aren't so bad. They're not so threatening. They don't hurt as much when you have that support. When you have that support and you have people to lean on and go to, and you have a circle to go to, you may be less likely to even encounter those situations. So I think that being able to find ways to get that support and move past the fear is actually super beneficial.
I agree. I think I was so surprised, honestly, when you told our mom that you were transitioning and how well she reacted, and how she was just like, you know, I want you happy. That's my biggest concern. And, you know, I was fearful for you to like tell them that you wanted to transition just because, you know, of the idea of the stereotype and how LGBTQ is in, you know, Black families and Black homes. And I think that's a big fear that you notice in Black homes is, oh, is my child going to be a part of the LGBT community? And I think that's another thing we wanted to really stress in our podcast is like, just because your child is a part of this community doesn't change who they are. And so, you know, when AJ transitioned, it was like, it was a no-brainer. It, you know, this is him. He's the most authentic being him. And, you know, I always told him like he was a way better brother than he was as a sister, because he was never meant to be that. And so it's important for people to, you know, we want to try and help people not to fear, you know, that transition, or fear what comes with that, their child or their family member identifying in that community, because it doesn't change what's on the inside. You know, you can change maybe the outside package or whatever, but you know, that character, that person that you raised or loved or grew to know, they're the same person. You don't become a whole new person once you are in the LGBTQ community. You don't just automatically change. It doesn't happen like that. And so I think the biggest thing is that sometimes people just don't know because they've never encountered it, or they don't have experience with it. They're not exposed to it. Or a big thing is people, I feel like, don't really have experience in just seeing other perspectives in an objective, logical way. And so I think that's our biggest thing, is just bringing these things to light and promoting them.
I don't know. I feel I want to say something, but I'm not sure how to say it. Or I'm not sure what the question is. So I'm just going to kind of say, which is my you know, my son is trans, and he's, let me see how to say this. You know, I brought up in the beginning how I was Jewish, working in for racial justice causes, and and I know as a young person, well, there was I don't know if it's still as true, but in my generation and the previous generations, there was tremendous pressure for Jews to assimilate, basically to be white, and I don't really necessarily consider myself. You know, there's how people identify you, and then there's how you identify, and to me, it's kind of absurd to think of Jews as white. Not to say that I don't have plenty of privilege that and privilege that's white privilege, but once you get into this whole racial mindset, it becomes craziness. I kind of and how Jews within a generation or two have become white when they were absolutely the opposite. You know, just like 2 generations ago, blows my mind. And so my son is, when I asked him how does he identify, he said Caucasian, even though he's African American, and but he's mixed. You know, he's got, and maybe I shouldn't say this. Maybe it's not mine to say, but it's also mine to say. It's my family. It's my son, and I was kind of like, really, and I kind of feel like he's keeping up the tradition of like assimilating or passing, and in a strange way, and I don't know how that lands. I'm not sure what I want to ask other than.
I mean, it's interesting because race is basically a construct.
Yeah, we're strangely related in our situations in that I have a black trans son, but we're also so different, you know.
I think that's part of what we actually want people to realize. Like literally what you just said, the fact that you can be like, you know, we have these differences, but dang, look at what still connects us. Like as different as we are, look at what still connects us. And I think that's actually something that we really want people to do. I think it's something that we've lost, especially when you start putting people in categories, especially when like race, things that we made up, like we decided that that's what this was going to be. Like no. So I think especially when you're dealing with those types of things, being able to realize, wait a minute, we actually have a whole lot of things that connect us. And I do know a lot of times biracial people can struggle with that, feeling like they have to identify as one or the other when they're both. Like there should be nothing wrong with being able to just be biracial. But you know, if you're dark enough, the world just sees you as black, or if you're light enough, then your past in the world might see you as white. And it's easy to go with that because we've made it really easy to just throw people in a box and categorize people and find ways to separate people versus being able to be like, no, he's biracial, he identifies as biracial, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that because race is just a construct anyway.
Well, I'm curious, and I don't know if you're willing to share, but you know, did he give you specifics on why he feels like he identifies as Caucasian opposed to identifying as biracial or black?
No, but he's not the kind of person that would have like a big explanation about anything. He's just kind of, that's where his gut tells him. And but by the way, he's not biracial. That's also like a misnomer because he's part Japanese. I mean, he's got like, I mean, it's kind of, even when I talk to even use these concepts with him, it just doesn't even make any sense. You know, he's got a, you know, his I don't know if I should say all this, but like, well, just his you know, he's the product of African American, I guess, you know, it's like his grandmother was was she born in Japan? I can't remember. I'm getting a little confused, but basically, part of his story is the result of like the spoils of war, where an African American soldier fought in Japan and married a Japanese woman, and it's all mixed up. How's he
Hmm.
identify in all that?
I mean, I feel like on one hand, I want to say, there's really no point in us even trying to specify or identify or label ourselves as, oh, I'm biracial, I'm multiracial, I'm black, I'm da 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 da. But on the other hand, I think part of it brings up this idea of maybe belonging. And I think especially for Black people, that's so important for us, coming from our history and feeling like we've lost that our origin in that culture. Belonging is so important. So, on one hand, I feel like labels do us a disservice, but on the other hand, I think it also is important for us to feel like we belong. Yet it helps identify, okay, I belong to this group.
And I think it's a special thing in America because of our racial history. If you go to a lot of other places, if we all went there together, we're all just Americans. We're not black or white. We're all just Americans. And so it becomes, where are you from? And it's really more about your heritage. So for him, it would be, being able to, first of all, know where in Africa, because Africa is a continent. So being able to actually know where in Africa, and then being able to celebrate all of your heritage, your Japanese heritage, your African heritage, wherever else you're from. And I think for Black people, especially because we don't have that, like we don't know what country in Africa we're from. We don't know, even because I'm sure most of us aren't just African. I'm sure we have a whole bunch of other stuff in us that we don't know anything about. And so we don't get to identify with those groups. I've had friends who are able to be like, I'm German and Scottish and English and Hungarian or whatever, and they know exactly like what they are. And so they get to participate in those things and bring different aspects of of that heritage into their life. And I think for Black people, we don't have that. And so we've really made it, identifying as Black as being like this common, unique, shared experience, which I understand. But I would hope that if we could get a better connection to the countries in Africa and a better connection to our heritage, that could maybe help us move kind of away from this really racial thing and into more of that culture and heritage, and being able to celebrate the unique heritages that make up America.
Yeah, and I hear that, and as a assimilated Jew, I have my own issues with like belonging, where I don't feel like, I was particularly astonished when he answered me as a Caucasian, because I certainly don't consider myself Caucasian. I mean, I don't even know where that phrase comes from exactly, except the Caucasus. And but there's a how the erasure of the Black history
Hmm.
through slavery, and then the Jewish case, it's like there's an erasure through something similar happens, where there's you know that you came from like a shtetl in somewhere in Europe or wherever, but then everything disappeared. You don't know anything else. There's like a dead end. So
Yep.
it goes back to it's not identical to the slavery situation, but there's similarities in that there's a hard end, and then there's no information, and
Hmm.
so you don't know like what happened. And I had like I had one great grandfather, the story went, who came to America by poking his eye out with an ice pick to avoid being conscripted in the army, and the Tsar's army, so that where the Jews were basically treated like slaves. And so, but I have no idea, but that's the origin story. I don't know anything before that.
Mm.
That's how it starts. The
Hmm.
man,
The one-eyed man.
grandfather with the patch, or the great
Have
grandfather with the patch, who I
you,
never knew. He died long before I was born.
have you in your life experienced discrimination, particularly due to the fact that you are Jewish?
Well, I mean, for sure, and the thing is it doesn't just come from white people. That's how we started this conversation.
Mm.
Uh,
Well,
and and I know that's a controversial thing to say,
mm,
and I feel odd saying it, but I feel like it's part of my experience.
I think people of color would also feel like there's a disconnect, with maybe the Jewish population, because I feel like from that the people of color's perspective, Jewish people are more kind of are closer to like identifying as Caucasian. It almost feels like, in terms of, I always use the example when we bring up slavery and, people are like, oh, get over it. And then, if you're Jewish and you bring up Holocaust, at least from the things I've seen in my experience, if, someone brings up the Holocaust, people are like, oh, that was a traumatic experience. Oh, that was horrible, reparations and things like that. So it's like, I think people of color maybe feel like Jewish people don't get the worst treatment, and not to say that one trauma is worse than the other, but I think I think there's this stereotype that like Jewish people are typically like well off and have businesses and are financially stable, and so I think there's like a big disconnect in those areas. And so in terms of that, I think that's where the maybe discrimination comes from the people of colors.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's an interesting relationship. I mean, obviously the Jews and African Americans have worked hand in hand on civil rights from the beginning, but it's been a fraught relationship, and it's kind of yeah, and yeah.
I
That's
mean,
one of the reasons I want to kinds of conversations, because I don't think it has to be fraught. I mean,
right, right.
I feel in so much agreement, but then I wasn't quite sure I understood what you're saying, Rachel, but obviously it's like absurd to have a competition about who suffered more. I mean, that's ridiculous. And the point is to be able to appreciate the profound tragedy in history, tragedies that have happened in history and that continue to happen, and that they're not all the same, and and someone like me, part of my family came to America before the Civil War, and they were Southerners. So, whether those Jews own slaves is, I can tell you for sure that I had one ancestor who owned a mortgage. It's a kind of curious story, and we're just as an example of how kind of complex this stuff gets. They had a general store along the Mississippi, and the Jews were the merchants, and often were forced to be the merchants because the Christians didn't want to be involved in borrowing and lending and stuff like that. But what happened was, during the Civil War, all the white people, the plantation owners and the white people down there had no money. So they had to pay for their goods with their land. And so that particular ancestor got paid in land, like along the Mississippi, which included plantations where there were slaves. And they were, I think they left the country during the Civil War, and they were very opposed to slavery, and they were opposed to the Confederacy, but they started owning these these former plantations, and so their mortgages included the property of the whites that were indebted to them for their chickens and whatever they were selling them, tools and stuff. And so, like, it's a possibility that there was slave ownership, and also it might not have happened. I don't know. And I've looked into it intensively. I haven't actually found anything more than the mortgage to indicate that it had happened. But that's, so there's a privilege there, but it's also, it's not exactly white privilege. It's like a third category. It's like its own weird component of our history.
Yeah, it's actually interesting too, because if you look at the census, anyone in like the Middle Eastern area, they're considered white on the census. And to me, that's absolutely crazy. Like, those people are not white. Like, you could look at them, they're not white. Like, I don't understand, but I think it's an attempt to continue that separation, right? So I think Black people have seen that within us and also outside of us, there's an effort to keep division, because together we're stronger. So when Black people and Jewish people and Christian people all come together to fight for something, it works because you've got all these people together, working together, fighting for a common goal. But the more divisive you can keep people, the harder it is for people to come together and to do those things. And I think it's interesting how you said it was a third category. I was reading something or watching a documentary, I can't remember which one, but it actually broke it down like that, how white people thought, back in history. And there was like, white people were considered civilized, Jewish people were semi-civilized, and then anyone Black or African or whatever, they were uncivilized. And so I think that, as you said, there's this assimilation that goes on. I think that sometimes that might help to keep that strain or that divisiveness going, because Black people are like, well, you get to pass, basically. And even there's no category for you to put Jewish on the, on the form. You just put white, like, you know what I mean? And so I think it can.
I never know how to answer those forms.
I think it can further that tension, unfortunately, because we're finding ways to keep that separation, because there's enough tragedy and trauma to go around. Like, there's enough of that.
I think also the issue that we're not addressing, and like verify that this makes sense, but white is a race and Jewish is a religion, so I think
Right.
we're also, it's kind of like apples and oranges, Jewish is your,
but can't you be ethnically Jewish and not religiously Jewish?
ethnically like Jewish stems from, like, you can be, I mean, correct me if I don't know for sure, correct us if we're wrong, but like in terms of Jewish people stemmed right from the Middle East. So like whatever your like origin was, that's how you would identify, correct? And Jewish is the religion that's stemmed from that part of the world, right?
If you're asking me, I disagree with you. Jews identify as a race, and they have for 3,000 years. In fact, they have longer than Blacks have identified as a race.
Because you can be, I'm pretty sure you can be ethnically Jewish and
The
not
race-
religiously Jewish, correct?
The race of Jews predates the white race, or the concept of a white race or a Black race, by thousands of years.
So it's like, what are
to hear what your perspective, which is the common perspective, that it's a religion, not a race, and it's just like, okay, that's maybe what people have thought for the last 50 to 100 years, but it's not what people thought for like 3,000 years prior. So
I think it has been changed to be viewed that way. Like, I think most people, if you were to ask most people, they would tell you that it's just a religion. Like, I don't remember where I learned that, but I do remember hearing somewhere that, like, it, like what you said, it wasn't just a religion, it was based on a heritage,
I
and
would
was an ethnicity.
not put that in the past tense. I think
Well, yeah. I mean, but I mean, when I say was more like everyone more saw it that way, like
yeah,
versus now, where Jewish people still see it that way. I think outside people have been, maybe taught or seen it more as a
yeah,
religion versus
I mean,
before, more people saw it the
yeah.
same.
I used to babysit for a couple of Jewish families, and they were like a little more on like the devout side of it, and they definitely identified as Jewish, but they also had, you know, a couple had Middle Eastern origins, and so they also like that was where they were from. And so I don't know, I think for me also having that experience, it's like, okay, so that's their, that's their nationality, that's their race, and Jewish is their religion, their practice. And I think, people identify it, but I think maybe as a society as a whole, we need to like define, what are we defining race as? I think that's what we need to clarify.
Well, I may not be. I'm not an expert in this, but the way I was raised to understand it is most religions have a confirmation or a ceremony to become part of the religion. Like you're not born a Christian, you become a Christian when you have the baptism, or you become a Muslim. I don't know what the ceremony is, and I don't know if it's the only one, but it's certainly one of the being being a Jew. You're born a Jew. That's why it's considered a race by Jews. You can convert to become a Jew, but it's not something that you have to go through. It's considered it's considered a race. I mean, in the
Not
sense,
a choice, not something that you get to choose.
yeah. Well, but I know like my brother has told me he doesn't think he's Jewish. So anything goes nowadays. Everybody. The point is, this stuff is all socially constructed. There's no reality to it other than the reality that we choose
Give to it, yeah, that we put to it.
and
I mean, I think you see it a lot in the Hispanic community right now too, because there are people who are like they're white Hispanics or they're Afro Latino. I think you're starting to even see that like in that community. So I think this is probably something that's gonna have to like continue to evolve as we continue to evolve. I mean, America is getting heavily Hispanic, and eventually we're all probably just gonna be one shade of sort of brown.
Mhm. Well, I feel like that's why labels are such a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, I think more groups of people are starting to be represented, and people so badly want to be represented. And so that label, they want to make sure that there's a label on it so that it can be represented, so that people are aware like this is important. And again, it gives that sense of belonging. But on the other hand, like I said earlier, it kind of is divisive in a way, and it just creates this disconnect between the groups, and this, maybe one feels better than the other or whatever, this divide.
yeah, and it's well, it's always shocking to encounter it, no matter how much we hear about it. And I, by the way, I didn't mean to imply that I hadn't ever felt the discrimination from white people. I felt that too. I mean, I've experienced that too, in the sense of, I mean, I can't tell you how many times. First of all, where I live, like in the New York metro area, there's the Jewish population is such a big part of the population, but it's still tiny. I don't know what it is. It's still, I don't know what percentage of the population around here is, but it's probably under 5%. And but large parts of the country it's 0%. And I can't tell you how many times, through my work and whatever, I've met people who are like, oh my, who I've been the first Jew that they've met, and and they said things to me, that would be like probably things that you've experienced when you're the first transgender person that they've met. Just like, holy moly, what are you talking about? And yeah, just very odd things.
Yeah, I think that's why we also, really like to push for knowledge because, conversations like this, we get more information, we get a different understanding, we get to learn something. And now when we talk to other people, we get to be more knowledgeable and hopefully teach them something that, they may not have learned. So I think that's one of the reasons we're always like, get to know things. Knowledge is your friend. Get to talk to different people and get different perspectives. Like that's actually the best thing you can do is to have somebody who is like, I don't agree, let's talk about it.
And I feel like, when you asked the question earlier, like what are we doing to promote these changes, I think a big thing is promoting effective communication and how to properly uh, communicate with each other, and emphasizing actively listening, and emphasizing, is both parties, and that it is work. It's not something passive that you do, and how to be receptive to criticism and being mindful of how you say things. And, again, this goes back to people do have to try, and you have to work at it, and you have to be considerate. And we're just trying to promote the importance of it and the bigger picture.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's nothing wrong with people having groups. I mean, even like we were talking about with ethnicity, it's great to be able to tap into those things. It's great to, have a group of people that you can go to. It's just we allow our groups to stay so separated where we're constantly comparing struggles, comparing successes, picking at each other. I'm better, you're better, trying to rank. There's nothing wrong with having your group, but realizing, realizing how connected you are. That's what I think, really want people to realize, like that humanity. It seems to be something that we're losing, which in my mind seems weird because we're more global now. So it's something think I would think would not be the case, but it seems like for whatever reason, we're kind of losing that humanity, and tapping into it, I think, is a mindset thing that will make a big difference.
So how do people tap more into your conversation? Where do they?
We are on all streaming platforms: Apple, Spotify, Pandora. So it's just called The Whole Conversation. Whole is HOLE. And then they can also find us on Instagram at The Whole Conversation. Just one word. Again, it's a H. They can find us at my Instagram, RAESTRAY. And then AJ's Instagram
at J Buddha. So that's at J_BUDAH.
And we also have a Facebook as well at The Whole Conversation. So you guys can check us out.
We're everywhere.
Yeah, we are literally everywhere because we just want to have the conversation. So, yeah.
Well, I really appreciate this conversation, and I hope we can continue it. And thank you guys so much for being on the Nature Breakthroughs podcast, and hope to continue.
For sure. Thanks for having us, and thanks for all the work that you do for other people, that you've done for our family, for our dad and everything. So we appreciate you for sure.
Yes, thank you. This was a really great conversation. So hopefully we can do some more of these.
Terrific. All right, that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to the Nature Breakthroughs podcast with Dr. Wild Ben Goldman. To discover what you need for personal, organizational, and societal change, get your free download of 3 ancient rituals smart entrepreneurs use to bounce back from shifts in the market and inside themselves. Go to www.naturebreakthroughs.com.